Now, before we jump into the digital equity discussion, I think it's always good to start with a reminder where digital equity sits in this wider sustainability discussion. As you probably have seen, if you've heard me speak before, you've seen the slide before. For us, sustainability is three different things. The first one is environmental concerns. The second one are economic concerns, and the third one are social concerns. So sustainability is about balancing all three of those. And digital equity definitely fits more on the economic and social side. Just turn on my laser pointer. There we go. This sits more down here on this side. And in my talk, I'm also going to try to weave in a little bit the environmental side. But digital equity is definitely about giving everybody equal access to the same economic opportunities. If you don't know this, if there's a lot of ideas in how to do sustainable development, which is of course also includes equity, in the original Brundtland report, where also these beautiful little SDG icons come from that a lot of people have on their website these days. They come from this very clear plan on how to do sustainable development in our future. And basically develop the world in a way it doesn't hurt future generations. So if you don't know that, this is, so to say, the foundation of sustainability and sustainable development. Now, which brings us to digital equity. So what is digital equity? What does it even mean? It's very, very simply put, it's about individuals and communities having access to ICT, so to information and communication technologies. So think about internet, data center capacity, to cloud capacity, to the tools, but also not just access to that kind of infrastructure, but also to have access to the right tooling, skills, knowledge, education, in order to actually do something with these things, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So that's the idea of digital equity. And every single time you talk about digital equity, you have to start with internet access, because to be honest, without access to the digital world or without access to the digital market, it's very difficult to create equality in that sense. So it all starts about connecting people, and you'll see a lot of statistics around about how 5 billion people are connected to the internet, and it's 2/3 of the world. But just to put that into perspective, that means that 2.6 billion people still don't have access, even they can't access the internet at all, right? Like no phone, no smartphone, no wireless service, no fiber, just no connectivity at all. And I think that gap ought to be closed. I give you, this is not something that the SDIA is doing, but we have a few partners, and one of them is Connect Humanity, which is an organization in the US that basically arranges a fund to invest into community-owned networks. I'll show you something. And they conducted a study and did a survey across a lot of different nonprofit organizations around the world, especially in the developing world, and to ask them about, what is hindering your internet access and your digital equity, so to say. What's driving the imbalance? And you can see here on the left that the majority of respondents said that there is just very bad infrastructure, so outages. There's just the speed is probably not adequate, and that they have general issues with the ISPs, with the internet service providers. So it's just generally hard to get online. And I think I tried to frame today not so much about, look at all these problems, but rather as an opportunistic mindset and a positive mindset. And I think that, this low quality infrastructure, I think a lot of people here in the audience come from the digital infrastructure side. That's an opportunity to do better, to improve digital equity, but also to simply provide a very good service, which can drive, of course, revenue and profitability. So the model of Connect Humanity is to invest in community-owned networks. And I think that's a very important aspect when thinking about digital equity. So having internet access done by a few very large global telcos is not what I'm talking about to create digital equity, because often that's then too expensive. There's a lot of limitations on the network. But what we are advocating for in this context of digital equity is that communities are empowered to build their own fiber networks. And fiber here is very important because it's very low cost, very high speed. And that Connect Humanity, for example, uses philanthropic money together with real capital from infrastructure investors to provide something that's called blended finance. So to finance these community-owned networks and essentially allow ISPs later to then offer services on top of that network. But then the fundamental network is always owned by the local community, and only that way there is enough. It will lead to everybody being connected, because if you look at economics for connecting a lot of parts across the world, you will see it's not very profitable to do so, and that's okay. But that means then we need to empower the communities that are not profitable to be connected. We need to empower them to connect themselves. And I think that's a very important step. So internet access is always one of the first things when we're talking about digital equity. Another thing that we don't talk so much about, but that's more in the realm of the SDIA, is the idea of regionality. And what I mean by that is so to say regional digital economies. So think about there's always two ways how an economy can grow. Is it can create its own innovation, its own products and services. Think about, for example, Uber. There's a lot of so to say, I wouldn't call them copies, but alternatives across Europe in different cities. Each city kind of slowly starting to get their own platform. I would say that's part of the regional economy. Or you can sort of say import a product or service, for example, have Uber in your region. But then you have to consider that there is a lot of the value that's created from, for example, simplifying transport is then extracted into a foreign entity. And I think especially for the developing world, we need to make sure that most of the economic value that's generated stays there and it's not being siphoned off somewhere else. There is a very good illustrative picture here of market caps, of course, of digital economy companies. So we often refer to them as digital product companies. And you can see here that there's already, of course, a complete overweight on companies in the US, but also China is very strong. And that most of the rest of the other regions, like even here, if we look at Australia or if we look at the African continent or South America, you see that most of these economies are literally using rather like some of the bigger companies instead of developing their own regional digital economies. And that's is often because they can't compete, because they don't have access to the right infrastructure. They don't have the regulation to support them. I'll go into that in a second. But the mindset we have to take is, how do we empower these regions to build their own digital economies, to create their own economic growth from digitalization, and how to get them to thrive themselves without, so to say, just bringing our products and services to them. That can't be the aim, and that will not create digital equity for sure. Another good model to think about this is also the donut economy. Amsterdam, where I live close to, was one of the first cities to embrace it, to make sure that all products and services that citizens need can be procured from within the region, so within the donut, so to say, and that the donut also, so to say, respects the environmental boundaries of the city. So there cannot be more products produced than resources like wood or water that the city can actually handle. So it's about keeping things regional and balancing them within that region, and really making sure you recycle, reuse as much of the materials you can. So regional economies that can be modeled after a donut economy, but I think the regionality aspect for me is the most important at the moment. To create these regional digital economies, you need, of course, skills. I think that's such a no-brainer. Of course, people need to be able to program, need to be able to code, need to be able to do marketing in the digital world, design business models, stuff like that. So they need to be able to innovate in that sense. But you also need a competitive market. For example, in Europe, we have the single market, so we can dictate how companies have to operate within that market. You have public procurement, which is always a force to be reckoned with. I think it can be a very powerful way to give rise to local digital economies. If the government, for example, buys local digital products and services themselves, that's a very good way. And I think it's fair to a certain extent to also subsidize local digital product companies and really give them an unfair advantage, because, for example, in the US, you have so well-developed capital markets, you have so well-developed venture capital funds and systems that in a way also subsidizes a lot of the startups, which of course you don't have the same matching financial markets in most of the developing world. So you want to you should embrace that they can use subsidies instead, which is of course technically not what we had agreed in the World Trade Organization, but I think we ought to let them, so to say, create unfair advantages for their local regional companies for a while, so that they can first of all level up to the same level that we're on. And you heard it before here, I put access to the internet again. I think these three forces, so creating a competitive market, upskilling people to be able to build digital products, and having access to the market, so the internet, are key. That's also, if you would ask me like how to allocate resources and time in a country that wants to develop a regional digital economy, I would say invest in product marketing, education, so that you learn how to, so to say, make your product visible in the digital market. Provide seed capital. That seed capital will most likely the majority of it will go to buying digital resources, so to buy compute in that sense for most of these companies. And you need to teach basic development skills, even though the majority of digital tech is open source, so you have all the building blocks. You need to still learn how to glue them together. And I think investing in the education around these basic development skills is also key. Now, the last bit, and then I stop, is also, if you have a regional digital economy, you also need to have regional infrastructure. And that has, first of all, to do with how much economic value you can capture through both, but also, but also adds to the sustainability aspect. I'll show you. And the opportunity that we see there, if you combine more the environmental aspect and also the digital equity aspect, is that no digital infrastructure can exist without energy infrastructure. So, or in other words, a server is a analog to digital converter that uses power to convert analog to digital. So without power, doesn't work. And the digital world is essentially doesn't exist if you unplug all the power cables. So you need to invest in both at the same time in most of these countries. And I think there is really an opportunity to think about digital infrastructure, so data centers, fiber, servers, power infrastructure as one thing. And two, I think good examples are always, if you have high voltage power lines, it's very easy to put fiber up there to protect against flashes. I think it's the English word. I always forget. Thunder and flashes. And so you can pull fiber up there. And of course, if you build data centers with certain power infrastructure already built in, like diesel generators or hydrogen based fuel cells or something like this, then you could also turn the data center, think about it more as a power plant that might also provide services to the surrounding area, rather than just thinking about it as a data center itself that needs power. So I think there is really an opportunity to think about those things together. A lot of those things we wrote many times already in our reports. But especially in countries where digital infrastructure is not yet well developed, I think thinking about all these things in conjunction, the energy system and digital infrastructure as one piece, as one utility, with just two different commodities coming out, can lead to, I think, a lot better infrastructure going forward. And to the economic point, I don't know if you all saw it, but there's a very good study from Ofcom in the UK looking at the cloud services market. And part of that study, they for the first time published the return on capital employed for some of the largest hyperscale cloud providers in the world, for example, here AWS. And it shows you that their return on capital employed is on average between 30 to 42%, which means that, so to say, $1 billion in infrastructure represents almost a 30 to 40% return. And that means there's a lot of economic value in the infrastructure itself. So if you build a regional digital economy with, let's say, a local Uber or a local online shopping site, then you want that to also sit on regional digital infrastructure, on regional hosters, regional cloud infrastructure, because otherwise you pay essentially a 30 to 40% tax to a foreign infrastructure provider, in this case, then a hyperscaler. And I think that economic value ought to go into the development of that region, not to be extracted and put, so to say, in a company that already has more cash than it can handle, and will most likely not reinvest that money into the local region, but rather actually get tax breaks and things like this. So I think we really need to think about infrastructure and the local economy together in order to close the digital equity gap. The last thing I'm just going to tease you with, it's not based on actual data, it's just a mental model that we developed some time ago with the Commonwealth, is about a maturity model. So the way you can, I made an example here for London, the way you can look at different regions is you can look at their level of digitalization and their level of, for example, IT service providers, or also how digital is the government. You can look at how digitalized is the finance sector. You can look at how many startups are there in a region, how is the connectivity, what's the population density. And you can, based on that, start, again, this is not based on real data, it's just an example, it's just a visual example. Then you can kind of grade different regions. These are all here in Europe, and kind of look at, so to say, where do you still need to invest in education? Where do you need to invest in digitalization? Or where is there high population density with lots of startups and not enough digital infrastructure, for example? And we believe such a maturity model combined with clear strategies on how to level up from one to another can be quite helpful in helping certain regions close this digital equity gap. Good. There was a lot of talking from my side. I stop here.
Thanks so much, Max. That was great. I mean, the first thing I think I have to say is that 2.6 billion figure is crazy when you see it written out like that. Considering I can't go a day, probably not even an hour, without picking up my phone to check some sort of fact or something. So I think that's kind of the first question. Do you think we need to start considering the internet along the same kind of level as access to water and heating and food, that sort of critical need, that basic, human right, basically, to have access to the internet and everything that opens up? Because I think that's it's a difficult jump, isn't it, when you think, what's a basic human need, and you think water, you think food, but internet, I think maybe it still has that connotation of, well, that's a luxury, rather than I need this to actually be part of a modern world and have the same opportunities and access that everyone else does. So how do we sort of change that mentality to know this is a basic human need, and everyone needs to have the same sort of access to this as they would other basic necessities? I
think, it's a good question. I think the discussion is already going on in the United Nations on making it a human right. I think so. It is a luxury if you consider it as a means to, watch TV instead of using your normal TV cable. You now use the internet. That's though a very Western phenomenon. Is that to displace stuff that already works with internet-based. We had telephones that worked, and then we had to switch to voice over IP, which basically is like telephony over the internet. Yeah. But these are also, to say, luxury improvements, a little bit better sound quality, a little bit better streaming quality. If you think about it very differently, if the only way you can vote, access information about politicians, access information about what's going on in your country, pay stuff, is through the internet, then the internet is clearly a life critical utility. And in a lot of developing countries, people are think about the scale of, for example, a country like India also. To participate in politics, without the internet is essentially impossible, because you can never, some people can't even travel to the main city or where the discussions are held. And so I think if you think about it in terms of political access and information access and government access, then it's so obvious that it's a human right. But we often think about it more in the Western sense of like social media and videos and blah. And I think I think we ought to make it a human right.
I was going to say, it's really interesting to put it that way, because you don't think of it in a way of, because we're so spoiled by having the internet around us all the time in the Western world. You don't think about it as this is how I can actually make a change in a country where I might not have that access otherwise. And you've kind of touched on something which I know we're going to talk again and again about over these 3 days. But it does seem to be, again, about this collaborative working within the communities you're in, but also within government, and at every level. So, and I know it's a really difficult question to ask, but what should people be doing on a personal level? I know we've talked about changing the idea of what the internet is and what it means to people, but also from a business perspective, because it's easy to say, I'd love to help, improve access to the internet, but when you've got a business to run and things are going on, and the world's been crazy the last few years, what can people do at a practical level to actually help that, whether that's lobbying the government, we spoke yesterday about talking to your local MP, and again, especially because we're talking other countries, which again is another sort of step away from, well, that's not my problem kind of thing.
Yeah, I think so. I'll answer it in a few steps.
Yes, so there's lots of questions there.
Okay. So one of my friends, we have a lot of discussions about, how do you help, especially developing countries, without being, the white people that come and tell them what to do.
Yeah.
Right. So the first thing is very simple: buy their stuff. Right? If you're buying jeans or if you're buying clothing, try to find clothing that's from there. Try to find furniture that's from there, and just buy their stuff, because it's essentially sending money there without, donating it or making like a feel bad investment, something like this, but rather just buy their stuff. That will help a lot. Very, very simple.
Yeah.
I think the second thing is about our Western business culture. I think as a business, don't be so hungry to own everything. Like, leave room for others. If you're going to a developing world and you're building a data center or you're building some fiber networks, like, try to leave space for the community, for local people to also engage and invest, or in to somehow not make it like 100% owned by you and you're building a wall around it. It's like, nobody can touch my stuff. It's try to think about it as a more inclusive business opportunity. We honestly, the Western world makes enough money. We are doing quite fine, right? if the decision is like, let's make 30% margin all by ourselves, or 20%, but we'll include some local people and we'll make sure that it's a bit more open business, then why don't we just go for the 20%? It's enough. Yeah. And I think that mindset of like, let's do business in a way that is integrating the community. It actually, we had that in Europe as well a long time ago. And it became like this all or nothing war. Yeah. And I think we ought to move away from that. It's not good for people, it's not fun, and it's not sustainable at all.
No. And like I said, it doesn't make you feel good at the end of the day when you go to bed.
No, exactly. You are constantly worried that somebody will come at your house and protest at you.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So what do you think, if any, what sort of role should legislation play in this? Again, I know it's a very difficult question because we're in the situation where, especially in the UK, we don't really know what's going on sustainability and how we're going to reach all of these lofty goals that we've set for ourselves over the next few years. What should the government be doing, and how should we be interacting with the government to make change happen, basically?
When we started so I come from tech, so I was born and raised on the mantra that regulation hinders innovation.
Yeah.
And I spent 5 years running a nonprofit, trying to get companies to collaborate and just, have a moral obligation to act more sustainably. And so I have been transformed over those years into somebody who's very pro-regulation, because I think it's very simple. We as citizens, we set goals for our government, right? We want go solve climate change, or go solve immigration. And the government then needs to set rules for the economy and for the people. And the economy means it needs to set boundary conditions for businesses, especially in the digital world, based on what we as citizens want. Right? And I think this argument of like it's hindering innovation, to be honest, there's this joke from, I think it's from Andreessen Horowitz, like when you read a sci-fi book about 2030 or 2022 or 2023, there's always flying cars. And we got Facebook. So I think you can also, regulation is very important in directing innovation, right? The internet would not exist if the US government wouldn't have said, we need this for military purposes. Go make that work. Yeah. So I think regulation can be very good at steering technology development into what we actually need. Another joke that I like to make is now we have AI and all this ChatGPT and things like this. And I still have to scan receipts for accounting, right? And you're like, I think it's great that I can now chat with this thing, but can we now solve accounting for once? Like, there's people sitting, taking your receipt and then matching it into the right category. And I'm like, surely
this can be automated.
Exactly. When I started being a software engineer, that was 15 years ago. That's what I thought we're going to solve first.
Yeah.
But we're solving all these problems that nobody has. And their regulation plays a really important role in just making sure that we direct all this innovation muscle, and we have a lot into the right problems.
So it's kind of, it's lovely to have ideas of making robots that can, predict whatever, but at the same time, there are people who are struggling at a human level that we need to redirect maybe some of our innovation to. Great. Just quickly, one last question before we wrap up. So do you think we're moving in the right direction and we're moving fast enough? Because obviously, again, as we're talking about, we've got all these things going on. We've got this skills gap that's happening. We've got all these sustainability things that we need to be meeting. So say the next 10 years is a crucial period of time. Are we doing enough basically to be where we need to be in 10 years for sustainability, for the skills gap, to give access, digital access to everyone who needs it?
No, I don't think so. I think, I think the only framing, for example, for internet access that has worked in the past is if you convince big tech companies that connecting to 2.6 billion people is basically making their market bigger. Right? That the economic argument has always worked. And you also see that the ones really driving fiber expansion, like sea cables and things like this, is not governments, it's tech companies, because they see it as an opportunity to make
as
it
an opportunity.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, but overall, like right now, the war is who can basically put their digital infrastructure on top of as many countries as possible, so they can capture this 40% that I showed you. And I think that's not a useful thing to compete on right now. It's like saying, oh, who can build all the roads faster? But I'm going to build your roads, and you're going to try to build my roads, and I don't think it's a useful way to compete. What we should compete on is lowest environmental impact and happiest citizens, right? Like human well-being. That I think a lot of people in the digital age are not very well. So there's a good moment to say like, hey, let's dial it all a bit back and just take really strategic decisions on what we're going to do now with the resources we have, but also with that makes our citizens happy and engaged.
Happy. Yeah.
Sounds simple, but it's not.
Happiness should be the goal. Okay, Max, thank you so much. That was really excellent, really interesting. A little bit depressing, but I think we have to face the facts before we do anything. As much as you can. Thank you so much. That was really excellent. And thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you for having me.